again, and I will give the word back to Christian.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all the presenters. This was a very, very good start of this busy day. And now, without further ado, I am very happy to hand over to Taberez Ahmed Neyazi from the National University of Singapore, who will be chairing a panel on contentious politics and information flows. Over to you, Taberez.
Thank you very much, Christian. So, welcome everyone. So I'm Taberez Neyazi from National University of Singapore. So I'll be chairing this session on contentious politics and information flows. So we are going to have three very interesting papers in this session, in this panel. So each, as we just to recap the rules, so each presenter will have 12 to 13 minutes to present, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. So once it's 12 minutes, once you pass 12 minutes, I will give you a warning. So I hope that is okay. So without any further delay, let's start. So the first presentation is by Ricardo Fabrino Mendonça from UFMG. So Ricardo.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Just share my presentation. Just a second. Okay, is it on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us here. It's a pleasure and an honor to present our article, and I'm presenting on behalf of Nina Santos, who is my co-author, and who will join us in the Q&A session. So we seem to live in an endless avalanche of protests. There are daily demonstrations around different issues in different parts of the world, and one can easily feel this ordinary sense of turbulence, uneasiness, and indignation everywhere. Amid several topics of interest to the study of contentious politics, this flood of outrage sheds light on changes related to the temporal dimension of protests. We seek to elaborate on these changes. We start by briefly discussing how temporality has been used in the literature on contentious politics, and expand on the main change we diagnosed. The second part of the article focuses on the impact of presentism over contentious politics in terms of rhythm, mobilization processes, and repertoire of action. So time has always been an important factor to the comprehension of contentious politics, but time was often reduced to points to be studied in order to understand the emergence of given social movements, or as a background to identify relevant factors of political contention. What's missing is a deeper comprehension of temporality itself as a factor. Time is not an objective and static element of the world, but a process shaped within social relations. Social change in how time is experienced have deep implications on social relations, retracting upon them. In the scholarship of social movements, Melucci gave important steps in these directions, seeking to comprehend how conceptions of time affected social struggles and how social movements reconstruct time. Studies around the concept of event have also contributed in this direction. They show the density of the present and its capacity to recreate pasts and futures. Drawing from the institutional theories, Della Porta discusses how protests may work as critical junctures. According to her, collective action may work as time intensifier. They affect the experience of temporality and reshuffle the possibilities of past, present, and future. The role of protests as time intensifiers can be thought of in relation to the acceleration of social processes. There is a growing interest in understanding the implications of the speed of contemporary life on human protests. Among the several dimensions that affect the acceleration of time, digital media certainly stands out. The current media ecosystem nurtures an overlap of different temporalities, which affect the logics of contentious politics. Rebecca Coleman claims that the experiences of the now are becoming prevalent in contemporary digital societies. The present was expanded and is omnipresent in experience always lived as immediate, while the future fades out in the horizon and the past is compulsively revisited. In what follows, we draw from examples that help us to explore how the expansion of the present relates to the rhythms, the mobilization processes, and the repertoires of actions. So a first aspect through which presentism affects contentious politics is by shaping its rhythms. Collective actors need to produce visible nows constantly. This dynamic may be illustrated by the reflection made by a leading activist in the Brazilian 2013 protests. According to her, activists soon realized that they had a window of opportunity to accelerate the process due to the attention they had initially received. In other words, in the words of our interviewee, they realized they needed to intensify the moment by calling for one march after another in very short time frames. The rhythm of Black Lives Matter seems similar, with a series of demonstrations in short periods of time. The movement points, however, to an additional element. It has been capable of extending its temporal dynamic over the years by remaining latent. From 2013 to 2020, the hashtag reappeared in several situations of racial violence. A similar rhythm can be noted in protest campaigns such as the Fridays for the Future strikes. This series of cases show that remaining on the stage is important and requires certain rhythms. It can either be through very intense and frantic campaigns, or through an extended pace that combines periods of latency and intense peaks. Rhythm matters, and contentious actors learn these through their practices. But rhythms is not all that matters. The current presentism also affects how process of mobilization happens. As identifications become more fluid and customized, mobilization depends on fast waves and intense communicative flows capable of generating temporary aggregations around events. Two temporal elements lie at the center of these processes of mobilization. The first one is how present events serve as windows of opportunity for the expression of indignation in diverse and unpredictable directions. Many current campaigns start with sparks of outrage around specific events and generate forms of solidarity that would not have been anticipated. These unforeseen alliances are clear, for instance, by their approachment between anti-capitalist Muslims, feminist groups, and Kurdish minorities in Turkey in 2013. Similarly, the Yellow Vests in France ended up gathering a great social diversity over several weeks. These different cases show how protests may work to pull different forces together. In a previous article, I have argued that by sharing the spaces and times of protests, individuals may develop a sense of belonging, not rooted in ideologies. Running from the police, chanting together, or marching for miles are activities that nurture a certain sense of community. There is, however, a second temporal element at the center of contemporary mobilization processes. Mobilization must happen quickly and through multiple and overlapping channels. Social media has therefore key relevance to mobilization, especially when we think about the role played by instant messaging apps. In 2018, for instance, Brazil had a huge strike of truck drivers, which was nationally organized through WhatsApp groups. Time also impacts, lastly, the tactics and strategies used to protest. Temporality affects the toolbox of alternatives enacted and reinvented by social actors. When one looks at current struggles, a first type of performance to be highlighted is the centrality of multitudes that multiply nows through several individualized forms of experience of these eruptions of anger. Organized in dissented ways, multitudes allow several centers of protagonism. This leads to a second type of performance at the heart of contemporary struggles: occupations. Transforming private buildings into squats, occupying public areas, or camping in schools, demonstrators seek to reinvent not only the rules of a polity, but the ways of experiencing time. The notion of prefigurative politics is essential for the tactics of occupation, and it's grounded on the idea that the future can be anticipated and enacted in a different present. They open loopholes of an extended and altered present in a rupture that eventually may lead to some form of reflexivity. The temporal dimension of a direct action is also evident in the need to produce immediate effects. Public shamings have become central in the contemporary repertoire of contention. They channel situated outrage quickly and allow broad visibility through sharing. There are also digital occupations in which avalanches of messages, emojis, or memes are used online to show the presence and strength of certain actors and ideas. And one last aspect regarding the contemporary repertoires of contention to be noticed is related to the chiaro-escuro dynamic of the age of communicative abundance. To the extent in which visibility and invisibility overlap in current communicative flows, political actors may use ephemeral features of communication to foster the visibility of certain topics to very specific audience in a short period of time. In YouTube, for instance, many videos are deleted by those who have posted them after a quick and targeted diffusion of anti-vax groups, for instance. The succession of presents creates the opportunity for ephemeral content, which is supposed not to last. So we have argued that presentism affects the rhythms of collective action, process of mobilization, and repertoires of contention in very specific ways. This article should be read as an invitation to deepen the understanding of temporality in the scholarship of contentious politics. So thank you, and we are happy to discuss the points developed in the article in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I think now we have almost 15 minutes for Q&A. So you can either type your message on the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you want to ask any question. So let me start. It's really very interesting paper. And also you have tried to theorize it, how we should understand the protest politics in the current very hybrid media environment. But what I was also looking at, because you are trying to look at different types of protests. So is, for example, when you are trying to describe temporality and also the dynamic of temporal dynamic and certain kind of rhythm, what was very interesting that you bring, for example, Black Lives Matter protest movement, as well as the truck drivers protest in Brazil. So I was wondering, is there certain kind of things that you are missing in your theorization, which is, for example, different movement have different kind of ideology, so it's also based on some kind of ideational change, So have you thought about that? So is there some danger in treating some of these protest movement as a kind of a homogeneous entity?
Okay, thank you for your question. And Nina, who is with us, please feel free to to speak whenever if you like. But to respond to you, so this article came from previous empirical studies that both me and Nina have conducted on different types of protests. And obviously there are major differences between the way that different collective actors move their struggles forward. But one of the elements that we try to discuss is how, despite ideological differences, there are common contextual factors pervading these movements, and that affect, for instance, the contemporary repertoire of action. So you see very different ideologies, very different social actors using very similar types of tactics and having to deal with common and shared social trends. So temporality, although we can talk about multiple temporalities, and there are different ways to deal with these multiple temporalities, there are also shared elements of contemporary temporality that pervade these different processes. And you can find traces of this factor in different types of movements representing different types of ideologies. So we're more interested in the commonalities between different social movements defending different ideologies and having to deal with this common context.
Thank you. So I think we have one more question here. So how do you think we should change the ways in which we research social movements and the media in light of the insights you have shared?
So the main point of the article is to look at temporality itself as there are 2 points. The first one is to look at temporality itself as a factor that needs to be properly comprehended in order to understand how social movements are organized and how they organize their tactics, their mobilization processes, their forms of expression. So looking at time not only to explain why social movements emerged here or there, or protests happened here or there, but understanding how collective actors have to deal with different temporal elements in order to produce their communicative strategies. The second argument pervading the text is to understand how social movements or collective actors or protests, to speak broadly, reshape time, how they reinvent pasts, and in reinventing pasts through the present, they make other futures possible. So, and this is what's interesting about this idea of time intensifier, or about the concept of event, understanding how they are not only producing events, but social movements themselves can be understood as an event that reinterprets past and future by generating a rupture in the ordinariness of human experience in the public sphere. So we are, I would say that we are inviting these 2 trends, understanding temporality as a factor and how social movements change time.
And if I could just add to that little element about the last thing Fabrino was saying when presenting about the volatility of online content and how sometimes things are posted and then they are almost immediately taken out of the web. I think we can also, this idea of temporality as something that has to be analyzed in itself can also help us to avoid a simplistic discourse about volatility, about acceleration, about how times run faster today. And we can see that maybe volatility can also be a strategy to make some contents more permanent and to make them have even more effect, more long effect that lasts long on society. So I think that that helps us to avoid this simplistic view if we question what's behind it.
Okay, so I think we have one more question here. So I like your approach on temporality, presentism, and rhythm to understand demonstrations. One thing that the presentation caused was the idea, the impression of absence of future and a consequent nostalgia of the past, as highlighted by Hussein. While you were interviewing, did you observe a nostalgia of the demonstrators, a wish of the past, and a lack of hope regarding the present tense?
Would you like to go first, Nina?
No, you can go. I think you were deeper on the interviews on this topic.
Okay, thank you, Isabella, for the question. I think that's a very interesting point, and that I'd like to further elaborate. So let me organize the ideas. The whole idea is that both present and future become more void, and in becoming void, they open possibilities for different ways to deal with them. So present can always be used as a tool to revisit the past. And we only experience the past through the present. And in experiencing the past, we can, in a certain way, construct it in different ways, including with nostalgia, and then imagining a golden past that can be revisited and that can be brought to the future. And this is going back to the first question. This is something that some ideological groups try to transform the future into an idealized idea of the past and to project the past into the future. There are also other possibilities of using these emptiness of both past and future to reconstruct other possible futures and to reinterpret past. So I would not say that there's the only possibility is to project a future that is reinvented reconstruction of the past. You can different ideological groups are trying to reconstruct past and future in the present in different ways, and this has to do with different ideological conceptions. And one more. Just one last element to be added here. The idea of the future as void, as empty, can also lead to different trends, because an empty future can be an absence of hope, because the future can just be a continuation of the present, and there's nothing really we can do because we are doomed to keep repeating what we're doing now. So this idea that there's not much democratic decision, there are not many alternatives, there's only one way forward, which is continuing the present in itself, while the future can also be constructed as a source of hope, as a possibility of change, and by shaping different practices in the present. So what we are discussing is how the present is a key element for social movements to reconstruct past and futures in different ways. So that's the main point, and the trend you pointed out is definitely one of them.
Yeah, and just one last thing. I think the present, although people sometimes can associate it with a lack of hope, they see the present as the time to act, as the time where it's possible to change, if change is possible. So I think it's very much associated to the moment where your action can make a difference. It's not on the past, it's not on the future, it's now. So I think that's a very important element.
Unless you don't see any possibility of the future, then the now loses meaning. And the now becomes a way to continue what it's understood to be as the necessary present and the only possible future.
So great. We have time for one more question, if anyone would like to jump in. If not, then thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. So now we move to our second paper of this panel. So the second paper is by Pei Zi from City University of Hong Kong. So Pei Zi.
Hi, I'll first share my screen here. So can you see my screen now? Okay, so I'll start it now. Hi everyone, this is Chester Zhipei from, I'm a PhD student from the City University of Hong Kong, and this is the working paper I collaborated with my supervisor, Dr. Lin Fen, and other university faculties. So any comments and suggestions are all welcomed. So my paper's title is Conventional Politics versus Contentious Politics, Exploring the Relationship Between Participation in the Social Movement and Voting Intention in Hong Kong. So for today's presentation, I'll go through with this line. First, I'll set up a brief introduction for this study, and then come up with the theory part. We want to borrow the literature of conventional politics and contentious politics to build up our story. And then we will argue that the competing theories was due to the different focus of the participation in the social movement. So we will reconceptualize the forms of participation in the social movement, and then the data and method part, and followed by the results and simplified discussion and conclusion. So the general idea of this study comes from the observation in 2019 social movement in Hong Kong. We have seen that during the movement, the voter turnout in the 2019 district council election had reached as high as 70%. And the theory of conventional politics and contentious politics, they have given many explanations towards its relationships, but several of them could explain what have happened in a hybridized regime, especially in Hong Kong. And meanwhile, 2020 and 2021 for now have experienced a lot. The political environment in Hong Kong is changing, and either the path of national security law or the postponement of the legal election due to the pandemic situation, or the fundamental revamp of the legal electoral rules just remind us that it's time to examine what exactly happened to Hong Kong and how the citizens' participation in social movement affect their subsequent voting intention. So in this study, we intended to scrutinize the impact of participation in the social movement on conventional electoral participation by taking the legal election as an example, examining the extent to which the involvement affected individuals' levels of voting intention. The relationship between the social movement and electoral voting actually reflects the relations of contentious politics and conventional politics. And previous research, they have concluded two mechanisms to help us to understand the interaction of electoral voting and engagement in the social movement as two of the most crucial forms of political participation in the representative democracies. But the relationship patterns seems ambivalent. The first one is disaffected radicalism. It holds the argument of the theory holds that people participate the social movement to show the disaffection to the conventional politics. So in this view, protest represents an expression of deep-seated sense of frustration, anger, or the alienation. So people attend more contentious social movement will mainly lead to two results, either vote for the challengers or just abstain to vote. And another theory is normalization theory. So with the normalization and institutionalization of social movement, scholars hold the view that the participation in the protest is a normalized behavior and normalize the voices of the political expression. So they will treat the political participation as a way of political learning. So more you attend the social movement means that more likely to vote in the election. But the above two theories provided the blurred explanations about the relationship between the electoral voting and the engagement in the social movement. But the seemingly ambivalent argument actually comes from their focus on the participation in the social movement with different level of involvement. And in the majority of empirical studies of disaffected radicalism, most of them focus on more violent, hardcore or more aggressive behaviors, while the other part, the normalization theory, mainly focus on some peaceful actions and behaviors. And the second concern is that the previous setting of political participation usually separate the participation with the online participation and offline mode. But with the changing media environment, the online participation becomes as important as the offline mode. And with the development of the media technology, a new forms of the political participation named the collectivism raised. So the collectivism means that clicking like on the social media platforms as Facebook and Twitter to show the support for an interest group, signing the online petition or forwarding the letters or the videos. So it means that the boundaries between the online and offline mode, they become blurred and overlapped. So the discussion around the participation should bring the resources back and started to emphasize the volume and the threshold of resources that the political action demands. And the threshold in this study could be understood as the function of an individual's calculation about the expected utility of participating in a given activity based on the likelihood of participation by others. And we mainly borrowed verbose definition about what this participation behavior costs, either the resources, money, skills, or the time. So in this sense, the high threshold participation refers to activities with the high resources cost, and the low threshold activities requires less cost. So based on the above analysis, we propose the following research question is that how is high and low threshold political participation associated with the voting intention in Hong Kong Legislative Council election? And also, we believe that the changing media environment not only brings the new forms of the political participation, and more importantly, the different media consumption will also influence the information environment, which lead to the affected polarization. And in Hong Kong, we know the media outlets were mainly separated as by the attitude to the democracy, were separated as the pro-democracy media and the pro-establishment media. So we initiated two hypotheses around the media consumption interaction effect. First one is the consumption of pro-established media will strengthen Hong Kong citizens' voting intention, and on the other hand, the pro-democracy media will also strengthen it. And then the media consumption will moderate the relationship between the protest in the social movement and the vote intention. Then I will quickly go through the data and method part. We applied a quota sampling with 1,000 Hong Kong permanent residents as our sample. And to measure the vote intention, we have three categories: will not vote, probably will vote, and definitely will vote. And for the political participation, we used a factor analysis and put the 21 political activity items during the 2019 movement into the component factor analysis. And then the statistic tools help us to generate two participation mode, 13 items for the high threshold and 4 items for the low threshold. And then it's about the, later I will put forward a straightforward table to show that which items are high threshold and which items are the low threshold. Then it's about the news consumption. Similar tools with the high and low threshold, we listed 17 media outlets, and the factor analysis separated them with 2 groups, 14 media outlets for the pro-established media and 3 for the pro-democracy media. And besides, we also concluded several control variables: political interest, political ideology, educational level, political knowledge, age, gender, and the national identity, and also the vote behavior in 2019 district council election. So here is the table for the separation of low and high threshold political participation. And as you can see that the 4 top of the items are belongs to the low threshold activity, and the rest of them belongs to the high threshold activity. And for the media consumption, we have listed these 17 news outlets, and the 3 news outlets, April Daily, Stan News, and Hong Kong In Media belongs to the pro-democracy, and the rest of them belongs to the pro-established media. So the descriptive analysis shows that over 20% of the respondents indicate that they will not vote. And the 35% of the total indicate they will probably will vote. And the rest of 52% of them denoted a determined will to vote in the legal election. And here comes to our main model. We could see from the first 4 rows of our ordered logistic regression, both mode of political participation shows a significant influence towards the voting intention. And separately, the high threshold political participation has a negative relationship with the voting intention. And people who barely not participate in the high threshold activity had a 59% probability to vote. But those who always participate in the high threshold activity only had 27% probability to vote. And the results of low threshold activity shows the opposite way. People who participate the more low threshold activity had a strong intention to vote in the next legal election, and those who participate the who always participate the low threshold activity had a 68% probability to vote. And for the news consumption, the consumption of pro-established media will reduce the intention to vote, while the democracy news consumption will increase the voting intention. And for the interaction effect, this figure shows the pro-democracy media's interaction effect. And as we can see, the democracy news consumption increase the voting intention, and this power is stronger for the high threshold activities. And the pro-democracy news consumption will increase for those people who always participate in the high threshold activity from only 1% to 56%. And the similar pattern also shows in the low threshold activities, but the pro-democracy news consumption was most salient for those political enthusiastic who always participate in the high threshold activity. And this figure shows for the pro-establishment news consumption. So the opposite with the pro-democracy news, the consumption of pro-establishment news will decrease the voting intention, both for the high threshold activity and for the low threshold activity, it will only slightly influence that. And for the discussion part, first of all, consistent with the more recent argument, participating in this low threshold activity may boost users' confidence in their internal efficacy by proving that they can participate in the political process. So they can encourage them to explore other additional forms of political participation in terms of influencing the institutional politics. And secondly, the finding concerning the high threshold activity and voting.
Sorry, you have 3 minutes more.
Oh, okay. So it echoes to the protest voting theory. This idea is that the protest voting argues that the political protest is disaffected voters. So more attend that means that you will be more angered to the incumbent government. So means that you are not likely to vote. And also the mobilization theory, the mobilization power of the ideological news shows that ideology news is central to the development of pro-democracy movement. And rather than mobilizing original empathetic individuals to attend political related actions, the news media could be much better described as a facilitator of the large-scale demonstration in terms of the news agency facilitating the participation of readers who already have the predisposition to carry out the action, like its ability to influence the high threshold activities. And in the next point we want to discuss here is about what election means in Hong Kong, that we find that Hong Kong was not always the democracy system. So people might run for the public office to legitimate the prior social movement. So similarly, citizens will join the election may also show a sense of memorize with the prior social movement. And that's what I want to share for today. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. So for very interesting presentation. So now time for Q&A. So either you can type your question or you can raise your hand. Anyone would like to go first? Okay, so let me start first then. So it's really very interesting because the way you are trying to draw the connection between those who are participating in contentious politics and their likelihood of participating in voting, electoral participation basically. So there are one minor point that I would like to first raise here, which is about the interpretation of collectivism, because as far as I know, collectivism is usually interpreted as a negative connotation, but the way you used in your literature, it showed like you are more positive when you are talking about collectivism. So that's a minor comment. But then the other thing I wanted to highlight here, when it's quite puzzling, because those who are participating in high threshold activities or costly form of political engagement, they are less likely to participate in electoral politics, which is in some way how it's counterintuitive. So I would like, so you did try to explain it, what might be the factors here, but then if I can push you further, do you think that, can you explain it with some contextual factors? So for example, as you try to explain the election in the context of Hong Kong, it might not have as meaningful impression among those who are participating in politics as compared to those who are not participating in politics, but participating in protests. So maybe they are quite disenchanted with the electoral politics in Hong Kong. So that's where I feel like you can try to bring out more peculiarity of Hong Kong political system to explain what has been happening in your data. So that's my first question. The second one is about high threshold participation. So basically what I saw there in your factor loading is quite good, but then the other thing I wanted to push you to think about offline participation versus online participation, So do you think that there would be some kind of variation if you try to disentangle these two high threshold activities into these two different factors, offline versus online?
Okay, so first response with the interpretation of the collectivism. So what I wrote in my articles was not the positive or negative views towards the collectivism. What I wrote the collectivism here is to like the rise of the collectivism shows that some political activities originally offline could be done in the online mode. So it means that the originally separation, the online or the offline, could be blurred. So so in terms of that, we introduce the terms of the high and low threshold to interpret the participation with different involvement level to represent it. And also, like for your second question and the third question, I would say that I think our study was basically comes from the Hong Kong context, and also I would like to borrow the theory of the electoral authoritarian regime theory to study it. But how could you replicate it to the further implications? I still need to think about these questions and scenarios. Thank you.
So thanks. So we have one more question here. So I was wondering if the risk of surveillance may be relevant here. All four activities that you classified as low threshold could lead to users being surveilled and possibly targeted by the government. So they may turn out to be as or even more costly than at least some of those activities that you classified as high threshold. So do you think the risk of surveillance may help explain some of your findings?
I think it's a good point, but for your thoughts, I haven't think about that before. But I will in our surveys there have some questions concerning about the attitude towards the surveillance and attitude towards the authoritarianism. So I think I will add them to see whether there has any differences.
Okay, so we have one more here. Could you elaborate on the media consumption of the participants of your study? Do you have any further information on how those media were consumed, if via social media, on website, or on printed press?
Okay, for the media consumption in our study, we mainly studied for the print media or the mainstream media in Hong Kong societies. But so as you can see, the 17 media outlets in our study were all comes from either the print press or the online news agencies, but without the social media accounts. But this is one limitation in our study, that in our second wave data, we could include some the discussion in the social media, like the Telegram and all the LIHKG, a very popular online forum during the 2019 movement in Hong Kong. So that would be the basic ground place for the pro-democracy supporters. So that would be totally different stories, I suppose. Yes, but for this version, we only included the print press. Yes.
Okay, so we have one more here. I wonder if collectivism necessarily the term you want to use. After all, isn't it more of a social construct than any analytical feature?
Let me think about that. I wonder if collectivism necessarily the term. Yes, the collectivism in our study was not the main term we could use. We just used it as like the introduce to blurred scenario that we could borrow the high and low threshold in our study.
Okay, so one more question here. So did you find any influence of ownership structure on the consumption patterns discovered by your study?
Sorry, I didn't know what the ownership structure means in your question. Could you elaborate it?
So I think, is it in terms of media?
Oh, okay.
Oh,
like the media press ownership. Okay, I see. So I think because in our study, the similar way to treat the media as the high or low threshold, we also approach like a bottom-up approach to use the factor analysis to generate it too. So we can see that the three news from the pro-democracy news, one is Apple Daily, and the other one, they all comes from like the independent or the independent ownered media. But I think the ownership structure of the media was the similar pattern with the pro-establishment and the pro-democracy. So the similar with the ideology structures. So I think it's not a big issue in our measurement.
Great. We have time for one more question if anyone want to ask. Anyone? If not, then thank you very much. I think it's very interesting presentation. Let's move to the final presentation of this particular panel. So the next presentation is by Yingdan Lu from Stanford University. Yingdan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Am I sounding okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay, cool. I'll just share my screen and my slides. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's very nice to talk, and I've learned a lot from both of your articles. So hi, everyone. My name is Yingdan Lu. I'm from Stanford University. It is a great honor to represent our research team to share with you a new project, which is on the information flow between the US and Chinese social media. So my colleague Kunwoo is also here today, and we're also excited to learn more from your feedbacks. So to start with my talk, the evolution of digital technologies have made it much easier for information to flow across national boundaries. The advent of Twitter and also Facebook, and as well as their global adoption, really accelerates the information flow of the information. However, as we all know that information does not flow free everywhere. Governments around the world are imposing restrictions on access to digital information in various ways. So back to 2020, there were 155 internet shutdowns occurred in 29 countries. As you can see from the figure on the right, China had more than 20 data regulations in 2020. China is also very well known for blocking international social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook with the so-called the Great Firewall of China. However, China is not completely disconnected or isolated from the world internet. Commerce and also China's economic prospects demand on communications in and out China has propelled a small share of people in China to buy VPN services to break the wall. And also at the same time, Chinese state media, they also actively engages in outward propaganda through Twitter, Facebook, and also other global media platforms. So especially during COVID, Chinese media reposted content from Twitter, as you can see from the left two posts. So for example, the post on the top is about how people from overseas countries, they appreciate China's help. And the one in the bottom is more that the pandemic in other countries, how it goes. At the same time as the pandemic has brought global attention to China, the users on Twitter also reposted news on the mainstream news website on how China takes actions during the COVID and also other opinions toward Chinese people. So how exactly information flows in and out China, and also how this interaction facilitates with other country or other media ecosystem is a very open question that is theoretically and also substantively important. In this paper, we examine the flow of information between the English language Twitter space and also the Chinese social media Sina Weibo as COVID-19 emerged in China and also spread around the world. Specifically, we pose the following research questions. The first question is, how often are viral Twitter messages also found on Sina Weibo? The second one is, did message appear first on Twitter or on Weibo? The third one is, what content is more likely to appear on Twitter and Weibo? And the last one is about what social media accounts they share content appearing on both Twitter and Weibo. So the data we use in this study is includes two public data sets of Twitter and also Weibo in this study. One is a public coronavirus Twitter data set and for Twitter, and also a public Weibo code data set collected from Weibo. As you can see, like from the data, like the data is very massive. So then we filter content to include only posts that talks about COVID and also talks about China. This resulted in a 1.8 million tweets and also 6.7 million Weibo posts that are talking about both topics. To obtain viral tweets that can flow from, or like we think it can flow from like Twitter to Weibo, we stratify our sample of 1.8 million tweets by week, and we extract the top 10 most retweeted tweets by week that are related to COVID-19, related to China, and also talk about specific events or issues. We excluded the tweets that are too general, like So for example, some tweets are saying that COVID-19 in China is terrible. So this kind of in general tweets, they express something that could be replicated, but they do not denote the flow of information of certain issues. And then we use those 150 most retweeted tweets as our sample of viral tweets to match with the Weibo dataset for co-occurrence posts. We should say that matching posts between Twitter and Weibo is a very challenging task because first of all, the source and also the language are different and the format is also different because Twitter does have a very strict word limit versus like on Weibo you can post longer. And also secondly, we need to evaluate an extremely large number of candidate pairs for matching so that we won't establish wrong theory of this information flow. This is an also very intensive computational task and also is a task that is nearly impossible for human annotations alone to accomplish. And thirdly, because social media test is very short, but very nuanced. So any fully automatic methods may have difficulty achieving very high levels of accuracy and precision, especially in determining whether two social media posts talk about the same thing. So because of those constraints, what we have found in previous literature is that people are typically use manual coding on the small data set to establish their theory. So to overcome those challenges, we developed a deep learning based semi-automated method to identify whether the content of posts from US social media co-occurs on Chinese social media. We focus on the top 150 tweets that got the most retweets and find the Chinese matches on them. So specifically, we have 3 steps to facilitate this. So the first step is for a given tweet among the 150 top tweets, we retrieve Weibo posts that should be further investigated. And also we rule out the irrelevant posts by automated methods. So we first translated the tweets to Chinese via the Google Translate API. And we then create a vector for the translated post by using word2vec and averaging the vectors in the post. So for each source tweet, we then retrieve the top 10,000 posts by word2vec. Those 10,000 posts are with the highest cosine similarity measured over the embedding. And those are measured with the Weibo post in the 11-day period of the timestamp of the tweet. So the second step is ranking the most similar pairs from that 10,000 posts for each tweet. We use a sophisticated version of text embedding called the universal sentence encoder for better performance. This method is superior to word2vec because it can capture context-based semantic distinction. But the thing is, although the USE is good, but it's too time-consuming, so we cannot, and also it's not realistic to facilitate from step 1. So we use this advanced and sophisticated method on step 2 to rank all candidate posts from the wider pool of that 10,000 for later on the human validation. So in the third step, as I mentioned, we have bilingual speakers. They validate each pair of the tweet and Weibo posts. Among those 15,000 tweet Weibo post pairs, the bilingual speakers went through one by one, and then like they annotate whether those are talking about the same thing. If they talk about the same thing, then it's a co-occurrence tweet and Weibo pair from our definition. To answer the first question, how often are viral Twitter message also found on Sina Weibo? We find that less than half viral tweets co-occurring on Weibo, given the time window of 11 days. And most of them, they have fewer than 10 occurrence Weibo posts. To answer the second research question, we find that 49% of the tweets have an earlier timestamp on Weibo than Twitter. So in other words, this means that those content were first posted on Weibo and then went viral on Twitter. There are 23% of posts have the same day timestamp on Weibo and also on Twitter, which maybe content talk about the globally, but we can't be sure of the direction of the speed of the spread. And also 29% of the tweets, they first appear on Twitter and then on Weibo. So this also shows that very little of the co-occurrence posts seem to be flowing from the US social media ecosystem to the Chinese social media ecosystem. So to answer our third question about the content of the co-occurring posts, we did another round of human coding and categorized the viral tweets into 4 categories. The first category contained tweets that criticize the Chinese regime or the Chinese people. So for example, blaming them for spreading COVID-19 for eating bats or some sentiment like this. The second category contained calls to stop racism against Chinese or against Asian people, both in like the US and also in a global scale. The third category describes the situations on the ground in China. So for example, how the Chinese government are taking actions to deal with that, or like how the emergency hospital were built. And the last category contained tweets that fall outside of the previous 3 categories, like the ones only condemning an action from Trump, but does nothing like with the US relation or something like that. So to answer this third question, so like the figure shows that the breakdown of the tweets. As we can see from the leftmost bar that contains all of the 150 viral tweets, the criticism toward China is the largest category, which takes 37%, followed by the descriptions of the situation, which is 28%, and other sentiment 21%. So for those viral tweets that we could not find co-occurrence on Weibo, the distribution is very similar to all tweets. For the co-occurrence posts that were firstly posted on Weibo and later on occurred on Twitter, we find that 59% of them, their content describing the situations on the ground in China. So as COVID-19 emerged and people in China use social media to express themselves or to seek assistance, content in this category might be spread to English language Twitter. The fourth bar showed a similar pattern that most content described the situations on the ground in China. However, when it comes to the fifth bar, which is showing the distribution of the content that appeared first on Twitter and then to Weibo, this remarkably different from the previous 4 bars. As you can see, the vast majority of content that appears on Twitter first, they're content critical of China or Chinese people. We can explain it in a couple of different ways. So first thing is about the perceptual bias that might influence the social media sentiment. So in China, there are strong perceptions that international media reporting and also global public opinion is biased against China, and especially when the US-China relations is getting worse. So this perceptual bias is getting worse. Secondly, this pattern also corresponds to the recent increase of nationalism, not only in China, but also around the world during the COVID-19. Our final analysis focuses on what types of Twitter and Weibo accounts they're posting those co-occurring information. To answer this question, we subset the Twitter and Weibo accounts by their verification status. So notice that Weibo has a more detailed categorization of verified users with there are basically 3 types of VIP accounts. There's celebrity accounts, government accounts, non-government accounts, and also, sure, thank you. Yeah, so there are also an ordinary user that has no VIP status, but Twitter only had like verified versus non-verified. So we use those verification information for our analysis. So for Weibo, we can see that the accounts of ordinary non-VIP users, they represent more than 75% share of accounts for posts firstly found on Weibo, and also the posts that simultaneously occur on both Weibo and Twitter. However, for content that first appears on Twitter and then appears on Weibo, we see like a very active participation of celebrities. This suggests that those who are able to access content on Twitter, either by going directly to Twitter or through some other channels, they include both ordinary users and also those with the celebrity VIP accounts. Also, Chinese government accounts represent a very small share of the earliest Weibo accounts posting content also found on Twitter. So when we see the Twitter account distribution, what is more interesting is that the relative share of Twitter accounts with verification status is higher for content appearing on Weibo and also on Twitter on the same day. And even it's higher for content that appears first on Twitter, then it comes to Weibo. So this suggests that when information moves from Twitter space into Chinese space, controlling for the popularity of the content, the tweets produced by accounts with verification are slightly more likely found on Twitter, on Weibo, than tweets from non-verified accounts. So to sum up, in this paper, we find evidence that information flows between China and US platform. We find that the description of COVID-19 on the ground in China made its way to Twitter. However, we also find there very little information flows into China. Most of them, they're content critical to China. And also we find that content flowing into China appear to be transmitted by the ordinary users and also high profile accounts, but rarely by government accounts. And this content is slightly more likely to become from the verified Twitter accounts. So finally, we want to brief discussion about the implications is that the results can inspire the next steps of studying global communication in the post-pandemic era. So to understand, especially understand how pandemic or what pandemic brings to the broader international cyberspace and its social and cultural consequences, we should not limit the analysis to public discourse within single national and social context, but we can just think of or like to facilitate different cross-platform or different cross-regional research. Cool. Thank you very much for your listening, and we look forward to your comments and also suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have time for Q&A. So anyone would like to go first? So let me start first then. It's really very interesting study. And what I found very interesting in your analysis is particularly about Weibo, that is still you have quite substantial number of a percentage of users who were criticizing Chinese government. No? So it was about 20%. And the post which originates on Weibo. So because if you look at general perception, you know, that such kind of criticisms are not allowed within Chinese social media sphere. So the first thing, so how do you look at this particular kind of criticisms, which that are the kind of critical messages that you found on Weibo in relation to Chinese political system or media system?
Yes, I think that's a great question. So just to make sure I got your point, so you're basically saying that how the critical to Chinese posts, the relationship between those posts with the Chinese system, right?
Yeah, on Weibo, because Twitter, we know like it's open platform and anyone can criticize, but Weibo is only those who are in China, they can only access it. No, so and then we see a lot of critical posts there, over 20%. No, if you go to your graph. So that's where I wanted to know like what was happening and how it is related with political system or media system in China.
Yeah, so for those content, those are mostly Chinese people are saying that, oh, like Chinese government got this kind of criticized on Twitter. And a lot of them, they followed by the comments by the Chinese people are saying that, oh, this condemnation is unfair. And also like, I think like it's also corresponding to the given intensive relation between like the China and the US, because back to like 2020, in the early stage of COVID, the Chinese foreign minister, they actually take very strong standpoint, and also like they have very like strong critiques on how US is stigmatizing China or like Chinese for spreading the COVID. So this is I think like this propels what I've said, it's the perceptual bias, because we think, because like in history that Chinese people has the perception of being humiliated by the Westerners, and we think that probably the intense international relations, it can intensify this kind of perceptual bias, and when the like there's critical things happen on Twitter, if someone who spot this, then like it might be easily to get into the Chinese cyberspace than other kinds of discourse or sentiment that is not critical to China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one more question here. I was thinking that one possible extension of this great study could be to look at whether posts from these social media have been picked up by the press, which could constitute another mechanism of cross-country information flows or lack thereof. Is this something you could do starting from the data you have?
Yeah, so we actually collected another set of data from the Chinese mainstream state media. We previously did a very rough comparison between the tweets, between the Weibo co-occurrence posts and the state media. So we focus on 3 state media, but we didn't find a lot. We only find like several of them. But I guess if we can take your suggestion to find like more, for example, expand our state media data set, then probably we can find more, or like we can facilitate this kind of like intermediation of media. It can be like in either direction, whether it's intermediate by the media to the Weibo space from Twitter, or like it could be like it first facilitated on Weibo and then state media found it's interesting and then reported it. So I think like, it can be like different direction, but I agree. I think it's a really great advice. Thank you.
So any other question? If not, I have one more supplementary question. So I think this is it's very fascinating study, you know, and also I think there could be a lot of implications of this particular study based on what just Christian Vakari has also asked you to look into, that intermediations between traditional or social media. So because now we have this very great idea, that's larger theoretical idea about liberal media, which is somewhere like US model, and then authoritarian media, that is China model. So does it, the kind of things that you found in your study, what you think would be the implication of these particular classifications, you know, because the title of your study, paper itself is Two Tales of Internet. So does it help in understanding or making much more nuanced understanding of these two systems or two different media system, particularly when it comes to online platform? So any thought on this?
I think it's a great point. I should say that I'm not making very strong claim to like to extrapolate my, because I think our study is more on like online media. So I'm not thinking of like, it can be extrapolate too much on the whole media system. But I do think like by the way we chose, for example, we chose Weibo and Twitter, those are two most representative online media right now used by a lot of people in different digital ecosystem. So we think, and also those are two platforms we chose them instead of other like Facebook or WeChat or like TikTok, because those two platforms are mostly public. So the sentiment are mostly public. So we think they can be very representative to the Chinese and also English speaking cyberspace, at least cyberspace or like digital media ecosystem. So I think for regarding the distinction between like liberal and authoritarian media. I think one thing we found, at least like I found striking, is that there's still information flows from the Chinese cyberspace to the English-speaking cyberspace, instead of from the traditional understanding of censorship is that only very few people can get like out of the wall. So I think this corresponds to our understanding of the commercial and also the other like economic prospects that propels this information flow. So I think there exists some features of those two types of media ecosystem, but I do think like studying the flow between them is of some value of our study.
Thank you very much for such a great, fascinating presentation. So now I would like to hand over the session to Christian.